I welcome everyone here and a very good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Kang, for accepting our invitation despite having super busy schedule. I'm Diksha Gupta. I'm Associate Director, India, and with my team here, we welcome you all on ACS Science Talk. And everyone knows you as vaccine godmother of India. And so you don't need any introduction, but just briefly, I'm so proud and honored to share some of your accomplishments. You are currently the Executive Director of Translational Health Science and Technology Institute, Faridabad, and you received your MBBS and MD in microbiology from Christian Medical College, and then pursued your postdoctoral research at Baylor College of Medicine, Houston. And then you are continuously working on development and use of vaccines for rotaviruses, cholera, and typhoid. And you played a pivotal role in indigenous rotavirus vaccines with over $100 million funding from Indian government and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is now India-approved vaccine program. You have a long list of awards and accolades, very difficult to mention in few minutes, but to a few. You received a prestigious Infosys Prize in Life Science and has been part on several national and international prestigious academy. Also, you are on several advisory committees of WHO and chairs WHO's Southeast Asia Regional Immunization Technical Advisory Group. Also the vice chair for CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. And we are so honored. You were felicitated as a fellow of Royal Society and had an honor of being the first Indian woman. With these words, I invite Professor Kang to share her wisdom on today's topic, understanding and unfolding the coronavirus pandemic. Welcome, ma'am. Now, over to you, please.
Thank you very much for having me here. What I thought I'd do is just very quickly run through some slides and then take questions, because things are moving at such an incredibly rapid rate that people have new questions every day. So any slides that I make today will be out of date tomorrow. So I've kept it reasonably general at the beginning, and as we go through, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box or save them for the end of the presentation. So just to go over coronaviruses, this is a class of viruses that is present in many species around the world. Among humans, we now know that there are 7 coronaviruses that are commonly found, or increasingly now becoming commonly found in humans. Of these, 4 are coronaviruses that cause the common cold. And usually we never test for them, so we don't know who has and hasn't had them. But if you look at the population of the world, almost everybody will have been infected with one or more of these 4 coronaviruses. These cause relatively mild disease, and we know of 3 coronaviruses that cause severe disease now. All coronaviruses have the same structure. They have a genome that is made up of one single long strand of RNA. They have a protein coat, and they have these spikes on the surface which look like a crown around the virus, and that's why it's called a coronavirus. It also has a lipid envelope, and the lipid envelope is why this virus is so easy to get rid of with simple hygiene measures like soap and water. So we're going to move to the next slide now.
Ma'am, ma'am, sorry
yes.
to interrupt you. Ma'am, participants request you to move your slide to full screen. Probably they can see it better.
Sure. Okay. And the problem is I can't see everything, but that's okay. So Right. So if we look at the coronaviruses that are beyond the four coronaviruses that cause the common cold, the first one that we encountered was the original SARS coronavirus. This caused an outbreak that was first identified as emerging out of China, which spread rapidly to Hong Kong, Singapore, several countries around the world. Canada in particular was quite badly affected because of travel. Now, this was a virus that was identified towards the end of 2002 and spread to many countries in 2003. But this was a virus that wound up being controlled after it infected about 8,000 people. And the reasons that it was controlled was because when you look at when people who were infected with the virus became infectious, it was during the period that they had symptoms. So if you were not symptomatic, you would not be spreading the virus. And as soon as you became symptomatic, since it caused severe acute respiratory syndrome, these people would wind up in a healthcare facility, and in that healthcare facility, if you had good infection control practices, then the disease would not be transmitted. So many of the infections happened early before people realized that infection control was the best way of stopping the spread of SARS coronavirus. The other virus that was identified is called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus. This was first identified in Saudi Arabia in 2012. This also originated from bats, moved into camels. It has been in camels for a very long time and causes asymptomatic infections in camels. And this has crossed the species barrier many times. So people in the Middle East have a lot of exposure to camels, and exposure to camels can lead to infections in humans. And then from humans, it can be spread to other humans as well. However, again, this is not a virus that has infected many people in the world, about 2,500 so far. And if you look at SARS coronavirus 1, this caused about 10% mortality. So 1 in 10 of people infected died approximately. And with the MERS coronavirus, it has about 30% mortality. So about 900 odd people have died because of MERS coronavirus. This has stayed mostly in the Middle East, but occasionally cases have been reported in places like South Korea, where a local outbreak was set up after the disease was brought in. Now, if you look at what happened in SARS, this has a lot of lessons to teach us about the similarities and differences between what we are seeing now and what we saw previously. SARS coronavirus caused about 8,000 cases, 10% mortality, and as I said, because we had really good infection control practices, this was something that could be controlled. But again, because this was infectious when patients were symptomatic, the high percentage of healthcare workers who were affected before we figured out that it was infection control that would lead to prevention of transmission of this virus. So subsequent to being able to understand that barrier precautions, careful nursing, keeping patients in rooms that were negative pressure rooms where the virus couldn't get out, were very important in allowing us to control the virus. And we have not seen any cases for the last 15, 16 years. The MERS coronavirus is a little bit different. It emerged in 2012. It continues to circulate in the world, and the reason that it continues to be present is because, unlike SARS, there seem to be multiple seeding events. It is something that keeps crossing over from camels to humans, and then it can travel to different parts of the world. In MERS, you can have an asymptomatic infection. So that is why it is possible for people who have this infection to travel and to carry this infection to many different places. So we have continued to see this virus since it emerged, but because it is not particularly infectious as compared to the others, this is again an infection where, despite the high mortality, we have not seen a very large number of deaths. Now, this new coronavirus, which is now called SARS coronavirus 2, emerged, as we all know, at the end of December in Wuhan, and the figures that we know about how much disease is severe have stayed approximately the same. 80% of people who are infected with this seem to have mild or moderate illness. We still have no clear understanding of how much infection is asymptomatic. About 15% of people require hospitalization. Most of them will go on to require high flow oxygen. 5% will be critical, and the mortality figures really vary depending on the quality of your healthcare system and the population that comes into hospitals. In Germany, it's estimated that mortality figures may be much less than 1%, but that may be because they are diagnosing much more mild illness, or as we saw in Italy, in the older age groups, the mortality can be nearly 10% because the healthcare system is so badly overwhelmed that when people wind up in hospital, their chances of survival, when healthcare workers are stretched, when ventilators are not available or not managed properly, it can be really high. The illness seems to vary. We know that there are asymptomatic infections. We don't know what proportion. And fever, cough, shortness of breath are considered a classical triad, but it's a very small percentage of patients, about 20%, who have all three of these symptoms. In addition to this, fatigue, muscle pain, diarrhea are all symptoms that are also reported in variable numbers of patients. This shortness of breath can go on to be an acute respiratory distress syndrome. This is believed to be more of an autoimmune phenomenon, and this can result also in multi-system, multi-organ failure. The mortality and the severe disease is seen mostly in the elderly or in people who have comorbidities or weaker immune systems. If you look at where the disease is, it's now the centers of the epidemic. The US has more cases than any other part of the world, and we've also seen large numbers of cases with a significant proportion of the population being affected in Europe. It's reported in almost 180 of the 200 plus countries in the world. And in many of the countries where it's not been reported, it's really been a lack of testing that has resulted in our inability to identify the infection. If you look at the case definitions that are proposed by WHO, I'm not going to go through all of these case definitions. These are very useful for figuring out who is a probable case and who is a confirmed case. A confirmed case requires a laboratory test to be able to say that this person definitely has a SARS coronavirus 2 infection or COVID-19 disease. If you look at a contact definition, this is very important in public health terms. And essentially, this is a person who has had any one of the following exposures during the 2 days before and the 14 days after the onset of symptoms. You have to be within 1 meter and in contact for more than 15 minutes. So walking past somebody in a corridor is very unlikely to result in disease. You have to spend a certain amount of time with the person to get the infection. Direct physical contact and direct caring for patients without proper personal protective equipment are situations where people can be labeled as a contact. There are also other situations as indicated by local risk assessments. So participating in mass gatherings where you may not necessarily know who has or does not have the infection can also result in a person being defined as a contact. Now, how contagious is COVID-19? Among all of the diseases that we know, it's very important to understand what is the number of infections that can be passed on by an infected person. And for COVID-19, this number is about 2.5. And that means that one infected person on average will pass the infection on to at least 2 other people. Now, this is important to understand when people talk about R0 or R0. This is the basic property of the virus. How likely is it to be contagious? But it is possible for us to think about approaches that can reduce this R to an effective reproductive rate of infection. Everything that we do in terms of social distancing, in terms of hygiene, actually intended to bring down this 0.5 to as close to 1 if possible. If the reproductive number of an infection comes below 1, that means that this disease is going to die out in the population, because one case will infect then less than one case, and the infection will not continue to grow in the population. If we go at 2.5, that means that this infection is going to spread very rapidly through the population. If we are at, let's say, 1.2 or 1.3, that means that this infection is going to spread very slowly through the population. You will have heard people talking about flattening the curve. Flattening the curve essentially means reducing the reproductive rate of this infection. So if we come down, we will be flattening the curve of the virus, preventing transmission to too many other people. Now, flattening the curve is important, but we also have some situations where we can't reliably always predict the reproductive number of the infection. For reasons that we don't understand, there are some people, and we don't know what the characteristics of those people are, who have the ability to transmit the infection to many more other people than the normal person. So if the normal person transmits to 2.5 other people, then super spreaders, as people who are able to have a reproductive number that's much greater than 2.5, can transmit the infection to many, many other people. We've seen examples of this with many coronaviruses. With SARS, we had a doctor who infected more than 100 patients. In MERS, we had one patient who brought the disease in and infected 82 other people. In 2020, with SARS coronavirus type 2, we had a British man who attended a meeting in Singapore, came back to the UK, traveled to France, went back to the UK and infected 11 people. Subsequent to that, we had patient 31 in South Korea, who was at one time responsible for 60% of the cases that had been seen in South Korea up to that point in time. So what distinguishes these people? What's different about them? We really don't know. If you look at Nipah also, the reason that we had so many cases of Nipah in 2018, but only one case in 2019 was because one of the Nipah patients was a super spreader who spread to people who just walked down the hospital corridor where his stretcher was located. So these kinds, it's very difficult to account for super spreaders when you are thinking about control strategies. And this becomes important for governments and for policymakers, where you have to have one policy for everybody and then another policy for what you do when you have a super spreading event. Now, how does COVID-19 spread? There's been a lot of discussion about, is this aerosols and, is this airborne transmission? Well, every way that COVID-19 spreads is actually airborne. Droplets are airborne, but droplets don't travel very far. Up to 6 feet is the distance that droplets travel. In some situations, people and certain procedures can generate small droplets that travel much further. These are called aerosols, and it's been shown that aerosols can travel up to 20 feet. But it's very important to remember that aerosolization, the small droplet formation, doesn't happen very easily. It's usually when you're doing a tracheostomy or you're doing suctioning, or certain kinds of people spread the disease more than others. It's said and talking loudly was supposed to have spread the disease to people who were in the same room as an infected person who did not know that she was infected at the time. So when we talk about the actually looks quite scary. What we're looking at in terms of an epidemic that grows very, very quickly. If it grows so quickly, the healthcare system does not have the capacity to handle it. This is the situation where you don't have enough hospital beds, you don't have enough ventilators, you don't have enough doctors, enough nurses, enough respiratory therapists to be able to handle the number of severe cases that require attention. Now, if you think about it, this seems scary. You have to remember that 80% of people who are infected will not require to burden the healthcare system too much. This is the 20% who have the more severe disease, who will come into the sharper peak of the curve. And you also have to remember that this is an unmitigated process where we have done absolutely nothing to try to control the infection. But as you know, we have started early with trying to control the infection. We have testing, we have isolation, we have a preparation of hospitals in conjunction with the lockdown. So what we are doing with all of this is actually buying us time so that the healthcare capacity, which is always limited in every country, has a better chance of being able to handle the severe cases that come in. So just to summarize where we are, this is a virus that has come from animals. It's found that humans are a good source. And in the 3 months since we got the gene sequence of COVID-19, we have been able to learn a lot about this virus. The amount of information, the amount of sharing that has gone on is just incredible. So what are the concerns that we have today? There's a lot of discussion in social media about all aspects of coronaviruses. There are a lot of theories. But if we focus from a more scientific point of view, the questions are there already drugs that we could use? Are there new drugs that we could make? And can we make vaccines? And when can we make those vaccines? By? The other big question is diagnostics. Everybody's heard that the WHO has told us to go ahead and test, but the test that we have that is reasonable at the moment is really only the real-time RT-PCR. And this is difficult to do in many settings, and the country has been ramping up capacity to do this testing quite quickly, but it's nowhere near enough. It's been estimated that we should be testing many times more than we are currently testing. There has been a lot in the news about the new tests, the rapid tests that have just become available, and these are reported as point of care tests. In some countries, they are even being touted as tests that you can do at home. But it's very important to remember that it is only 3 months since we got to know about this virus. These tests have not been well validated. Usually it takes a long time to develop a good diagnostic. And in this case, that has not happened because regulators are providing emergency use authorizations. There are more than 400 kits that are in the market globally, but there is a group called the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics that is just starting the process of conducting the validation of 100 plus kits. So when this is done, we will have a better idea of how all the kits that are on the market are performing. Now, there is a lot of interest in repurposing of drugs, and the drugs that are being looked at are broad spectrum antiviral agents. There are many of these. The ones that are most in the news are lopinavir and ritonavir. These are anti-HIV drugs that have been quite widely tried and are in clinical trials. The first clinical trial was a little bit disappointing, but this is also included in the WHO's Solidarity trial, which is a multi-country study using this combination with and without interferon 1 beta. Remdesivir is another antiviral that was developed originally for Ebola. It showed some promise for MERS and is now being evaluated in clinical trials for SARS coronavirus 2. Favipiravir is developed for influenza. It was licensed, it's made in Japan and has been approved in China for use of SARS coronavirus type 2. Hydroxychloroquine with and without azithromycin is very much in the news. Opinion is divided about whether it will work or not. There have been small clinical trials. More recently, from the same French group, a larger number has come out, and they seem to think that it shows promise. Other trials have not been quite as definitive as the data from the French studies, and there were issues with the early studies as well. There are also safety issues associated with chloroquine, less with hydroxychloroquine, and we are thinking about giving hydroxychloroquine for a shorter period of time, so it's possible that the side effects might be even less in that case. Now, when you look at repurposing, it always looks great to say that we will run screening tests and we will be able to find things that are likely to work. But the problem with screens is that the hits that you get, particularly as single agents, tend to have low potency, and their maximum tolerated dose is often subtherapeutic. So you need to do a lot of chemistry to make sure that these might be usable. A different approach is to evaluate 2 or more drugs that work on different cellular signaling pathways so that you get approaches where resistance will also develop less easily and there is potentiation of the antiviral effect. Another strategy is to do high throughput screening of compound libraries, looking for synergistic combinations. And this is something that has been facilitated by a recent report of the host virus interactome, at least for 26 of the 29 proteins of the SARS coronavirus type 2. Now, moving to vaccines, during the past 20 years, we've had a lot of new technologies that have been used for vaccine design. There are currently about 80 projects that are at reasonable stages of progression for looking at vaccine candidates, and among them, about 43 are quite far along. There are currently 4, as far as I'm aware, studies that are in phase 1 clinical trials, 2 more expected to go into phase 1 very quickly now. And these use a range of different kinds of technologies, from proteins that are designed through structural vaccinology to RNA and DNA vaccines. So far, we have not had antigen selection driven by the human immune response, but this is also an approach that is being considered. So we are using old technologies like inactivated viruses to the newest possible technologies to have as many vaccine candidates as possible. And this is important because most vaccine candidates will fail. Now, one of the groups that I work with, I'm vice chair of the board of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. This is a program that started after Ebola, and the idea was to make vaccines that are neglected by multinational companies. So it started with Lassa, MERS, Nipah, and then Rift Valley fever and chikungunya were added last year. But all through, in the 2 years that CEPI has been in existence, there has always been a focus on disease X, which is the unknown disease that might emerge from anywhere and might cause disease in unknown numbers of people. And SARS coronavirus type 2 is disease X. So CEPI had already funded platform technologies, which were essentially rapid response platforms for being able to quickly make vaccines. And because CEPI had that, it was able to, within 2.5 weeks of the sequence becoming available, support 3 vaccine candidates. It now has 8 vaccine candidates that have been funded in the last 3 months, as well as another set of studies. Now there are 2 vaccine candidates that are in clinical trials from Moderna and from Inovio, which is an mRNA and a DNA vaccine. And CureVac's mRNA vaccine will enter phase 1 in April. And there is a program with the University of Oxford where it will be going directly to phase 2 studies in May and June. So just to summarize, this is new. There are lots of unknowns here, but what has been amazing to me is how much we have learned, how quickly. It's very important that we continue to work together, not just as scientists, but as people, to make sure that we protect at-risk populations, prevent spread, and contain outbreaks as rapidly as possible. So I'll stop there and I'd be happy to take questions.